The winter storm struck Blackthorne Castle like punishment, pressing against ancient stone as if the world had grown tired of mercy. Towers groaned under wind, and corridors carried whispers that felt almost human, as if rumor itself had taken shelter inside the fortress. Every candle burned with a hesitant flame, as though even light feared what was coming. Duke Adrian Blackthorne stood on the highest balcony, unmoving, his silhouette cut against the white chaos of the storm. He was shaped by war councils and broken treaties, a ruler who no longer asked if decisions were right, only if they were necessary. The sealed message in his chamber had already been read 3 times, yet its words still clung like frost. The marriage contract had been arranged months earlier, inked in desperation disguised as diplomacy. House Valemont required protection, House Blackthorne required stability, and Adrian required neither compassion nor love, only order in a fragile realm. The bride promised to him was Lady Elira Valemont, a name without image, only distortion. Some called her cursed, others disfigured, and many said she was never meant to be seen. In Ravengard she existed as rumor more than person. No portrait hung in halls, no song described her face. Envoys were forbidden from asking about her, as if inquiry itself might invite misfortune. The only certainty was her veil. It was said she had never removed it, not even before those sworn to protect her. Adrian had not objected to the arrangement. He asked no questions, offered no sympathy. To him, marriage was structure, not story. If it secured peace along the borders, it served its purpose. Emotion had never survived long in Ravengard, and he had ensured it never would interfere with his rule. Yet on the eve of the ceremony, when the castle was quiet enough to hear snow settle, a letter arrived without seal or herald. It lay on his desk as though placed by intent. The parchment was thin, the ink uneven, written in haste or fear. Do not trust what they tell you about the bride. The truth is hidden behind the veil and behind your past. Adrian read it once, then again, searching for trick or sabotage. He found none. Still, he folded it and burned it, watching it turn to ash. Information without proof was poison in his world. But even as it vanished, something unfamiliar settled in him. Not fear, but a quieter doubt, like a question he had never allowed himself to ask. Below, horns announced the Valemont arrival. Snow thickened as if the sky wished to hide what came next. Gates opened slowly, revealing a black carriage drawn by weary horses. No banners, no music, only silence. Servants lined the path, breath visible in cold air. Nobles watched from windows as if this were an execution rather than a wedding. The carriage doors opened, and silence deepened further, as though even the storm paused. She stepped out first. Lady Elira Valemont. She wore no ornament, only layered black silk, the veil covering everything. It moved slightly with wind but revealed nothing, as if trained to guard secrets. Her presence did not waver under scrutiny. Instead, she seemed aware of every gaze, counting them without turning her head. There was no fear in her posture, only control. She moved with precision that did not belong to someone broken, but to someone prepared. Whispers erupted among nobles. Words like ghost and burden slipped through the crowd. Yet Adrian did not look away. Something about her disrupted expectation. She did not resemble a woman being delivered to fate, but someone arriving at a destination already known. As she walked, snow clung briefly to her veil then melted away. Even guards adjusted their stance, unsettled by her calm. The world seemed unsure whether to accept or resist her presence. Inside the hall, candles flickered against stone as the ceremony began. The priest's voice echoed, distant and formal. Adrian listened without change in expression. When vows ended, all eyes turned to the veiled bride. A pause stretched too long. Then her voice emerged. Soft, measured, steady. I accept. 2 words. Yet they lingered, heavier than expected, as if remembered rather than spoken. For the first time, Adrian felt a fracture in certainty. Because in that moment he understood something had already begun long before the ceremony, and the woman beside him was not only a bride promised in shame but a question wrapped in silk, waiting for the moment it would finally be answered. Outside the hall, the storm pressed harder against the castle walls, as if reacting to what had just taken shape inside. Adrian remained still, but something in him no longer matched the discipline he had built his life upon. Every instinct told him to dismiss the feeling, to label it as political uncertainty, yet the sensation refused classification. It lingered like an echo that did not belong to the present moment. Across the hall, beneath layers of black silk, Elira stood without movement, yet her silence felt different now, no longer passive but intentional, as though she had already measured every consequence of this night and accepted them long before arriving. The nobles began to shift uneasily, their earlier laughter fading into cautious observation, as if the veil no longer concealed weakness but concealed something they had failed to understand. And in that fragile balance between judgment and unknown truth, the ceremony did not feel like an ending, but the first step into something neither the Duke nor the court could yet name, a beginning that had been waiting long before either of them had agreed to meet at the altar. Even the air inside the hall felt altered, heavier with unspoken history that neither nobles nor priests could articulate, as though the marriage had already rewritten the rules of silence itself, binding both bride and groom to consequences that extended far beyond the ceremony and into the unseen architecture of power and control itself. The morning arrived under a sky so heavy it seemed unwilling to witness what was about to unfold. Blackthorne Castle stood like a forgotten monument carved into winter itself, its towers wrapped in frost and silence. No banners moved in celebration. No music welcomed the day. Only the distant sound of wind pressing against stone like an unanswered question. Inside the castle gates, preparation had turned into ritual. Servants moved with disciplined urgency, polishing surfaces already clean, arranging candles already placed, adjusting details that required no adjustment. Everything was performed not for necessity, but for appearance, as though order could disguise uncertainty. Beneath it all, tension pulsed quietly through every corridor. Duke Adrian Blackthorne did not speak as he dressed. His reflection in the mirror showed no hesitation, only a controlled stillness shaped by years of command. Yet even he could not ignore the strange weight pressing behind his thoughts, a residue of the letter he had burned and the doubt he had refused to name. When the first horn sounded beyond the gates, the castle shifted. Not in movement but in awareness. Every servant paused for half a breath before resuming their tasks. Every noble guest turned toward the windows. The arrival had begun. The carriage appeared at the edge of the snowfield like something emerging from another world. Dark wood, unmarked, drawn by horses whose breath rose like fading smoke. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though it did not belong to time but to expectation itself. As it approached, silence deepened unnaturally. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Guards tightened their grip on spears, not from command but instinct. Something about the carriage disrupted certainty, as if it carried not a bride but consequence. Inside the grand hall, candles flickered in long rows, casting gold against stone walls carved by generations of rulers who believed permanence was possible. Nobles gathered in layered silks and restrained expressions, each face carefully composed, each whisper concealed behind etiquette. Yet beneath the elegance, curiosity sharpened into hunger. Adrian stood at the altar without movement. He did not turn when the doors opened. He already knew the moment had arrived. The doors of the carriage finally opened. No announcement followed. No escort stepped forward. Only silence widened. Then she appeared. Lady Elira Valemont stepped down into the snow without hesitation. Her form was entirely concealed in layered black silk, the veil descending from head to feet in seamless darkness. There was no visible skin, no expression, no hint of identity. She did not move like someone arriving, but like someone continuing a journey already in progress. The wind struck her veil, but it did not reveal anything beneath it. Instead, the fabric responded like something alive, adjusting, settling, refusing intrusion. Even the guards watching her felt an instinctive discomfort, as though they were witnessing something not meant for observation. Whispers erupted behind the windows. That must be her. They said she never shows her face. I heard she cannot speak. I heard she should not exist at all. Yet Elira did not react. Her head remained slightly lowered, not in submission but in focus. Each step she took toward the castle gates was measured, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Snow compressed beneath her feet with quiet certainty. Adrian finally turned. His gaze locked onto her silhouette. He had expected hesitation, weakness, or visible burden. Instead he saw control. Not fragile control, but disciplined restraint, as though she had already mastered every possible reaction others might attempt to extract from her. Something unfamiliar stirred in him, not curiosity alone, but recognition of something that did not fit the narrative he had been given. The procession began toward the hall. Nobles leaned closer as she passed, hoping for flaw or confirmation of rumor. None came. Even her silence felt structured, not empty. It was as though she chose not to speak because speech would have been unnecessary. When she entered the grand hall, the temperature seemed to change. Candles wavered, not from wind, but from collective attention shifting toward her. The weight of hundreds of eyes pressed against her veil, yet she did not falter. Adrian stepped forward once, then stopped. The priest began the ceremony, voice steady, rehearsed, ceremonial. Words of union, obligation, alliance, and fate filled the hall. Yet none of it felt final. It felt suspended, waiting for something unseen to confirm or deny it. When asked to speak, Adrian answered first. His voice was controlled, measured, without emotion. He fulfilled his part as expected, as ruler, as contract bearer, as man shaped by duty rather than desire. Then the priest turned to her. A silence followed that felt longer than reason allowed. Elira lifted her head slightly. For the first time, a shift occurred beneath the veil, not visible but perceptible. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Then she spoke. "I accept." 2 words. No tremor. No hesitation. No softness. The sound carried through the hall like something precise being placed into position. It was not submission. It was declaration. A faint unease passed through the nobles. Something in her tone resisted interpretation. It did not belong to fear or obedience. It belonged to certainty. Adrian felt it immediately. This was not a woman stepping into uncertainty. This was a woman stepping into alignment with something already decided. The ceremony continued, but the meaning behind it began to fracture. Every candle, every gaze, every word now felt secondary to the presence standing beside him. When the final vow was spoken, Elira remained still. Adrian did not move either. For a brief moment, the hall existed in suspended logic, as though reality itself was waiting for instruction. And then, beneath layers of black silk, Elira turned her head ever so slightly toward him. Not enough to reveal. Just enough to acknowledge. And in that smallest motion, Adrian understood something without yet being able to name it. The marriage had not begun today. It had only revealed itself. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the castle walls, and for the first time since the contract was signed, Adrian wondered whether he had truly agreed to a union, or walked willingly into something that had been waiting for him long before he ever believed he had a choice. After the marriage, Blackthorne Castle did not change in appearance, yet something within its structure began to feel altered. The corridors remained the same length, the stone the same cold gray, the windows the same fractured glass of winter light. But silence, once passive, had become deliberate, as though the castle itself was now listening. Lady Elira Valemont remained within those halls like a presence without permission, never asking for space yet occupying every corner. She did not remove her veil, nor did she explain her actions. Yet change followed her as naturally as shadow follows flame. Servants who had once spoken freely now chose words carefully. Doors that had been locked for years were suddenly opened without explanation. Records that had been ignored were reorganized overnight. Duke Adrian observed without interruption. He did not intervene, nor did he attempt to assert authority over changes he had not ordered. Instead, he watched patterns emerge where chaos should have been. Accounts of the estate, once inconsistent, now aligned with impossible precision. Expenditures that had been hidden resurfaced in perfect clarity. It was not correction. It was revelation. On the 3rd night after the ceremony, Adrian found himself drawn toward the lower archives of the castle. He told no one. Even the guards outside his chamber were dismissed with simple gestures. The stone staircase descended into colder air, each step echoing like a thought he had refused to acknowledge. He found her there. Lady Elira stood among ancient shelves, surrounded by records of generations long buried in political silence. She did not turn when he entered. Instead, she continued reading, fingers tracing lines of ink as though they were maps rather than history. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but sharpened by restraint. "You move through my castle as though you already know it." The words were not accusation alone, but inquiry shaped by discomfort. Elira closed the book slowly, as if concluding a conversation only she had been part of. "Some places are not new to those who inherit their consequences," she replied softly. Her tone carried neither insult nor apology, only quiet certainty. Adrian stepped closer, studying her silhouette. Even without seeing her face, he felt the weight of intention behind her stillness. He demanded answers, but she offered none directly. Instead, she placed a folded set of documents onto the table between them. "Your family records are incomplete," she said. "Not by accident." The words lingered in the dim light like something unstable. Adrian opened the documents. What he saw disrupted the structure of what he believed to be truth. Names crossed out. Dates misaligned. Entire events missing from official history. Yet beneath it all, annotations in a handwriting he did not recognize but somehow felt familiar. He looked up sharply, but Elira had already turned away, walking deeper into the archives. Some truths are preserved, she said without looking back. Others are buried carefully enough that even their absence becomes tradition. That night, Adrian could not sleep. The castle felt different again, but this time not because of change, but because of exposure. Every wall seemed thinner, every shadow more intentional. He replayed her words repeatedly, searching for manipulation, yet finding only structure. By dawn, another message arrived. It was not sealed, not delivered formally. It was simply placed on his desk as though it had always belonged there. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet its tone carried unsettling certainty. She is not who you believe. You once destroyed her family. Adrian read it once, then again, but the meaning did not shift. Instead, it deepened as though each reading added weight rather than clarity. The castle beyond his window remained still, yet his mind no longer aligned with its silence. He turned toward the corridor leading to the archives, where Elira had disappeared hours earlier, and for the first time since taking the throne, Duke Adrian Blackthorne questioned not what she was doing inside his castle, but whether the castle had ever truly been his at all. In the silence that followed his realization, Adrian felt the castle shift in a way that was not physical but perceptual, as though every stone corridor had begun to rearrange itself around a truth it had long been forced to conceal. He stepped forward slowly, each movement heavier than the last, aware now that the boundaries of authority he had always trusted were no longer fixed but fragile constructs maintained only by silence and agreement. The archives below seemed to call to him not with sound, but with memory embedded in stone and ink and unanswered questions that refused to remain buried. Elira had vanished deeper into the labyrinth of knowledge that existed beneath the castle, and Adrian understood that following her would mean crossing into a version of his world that could no longer be undone. The message on his desk pulsed in his mind like a second heartbeat, repeating its accusation without sound. You once destroyed her family, and now the weight of that sentence transformed from information into consequence. The storm outside intensified, striking the walls with renewed violence as if responding to the instability forming within the castle itself. Adrian realized that Elira had not merely entered his domain but had rewritten the logic that defined it, and somewhere within those shifting foundations she was waiting, not as captive or guest but as architect of a truth he had not yet fully faced. And the deeper he moved toward understanding. Royal banquet held in Grand Hall of Blackthorne Castle under crystal chandeliers and trembling candlelight as nobles gathered to witness the official declaration of peace between Ravengard and Valemont territories, the air heavy with anticipation and hidden malice. Adrian stood at the elevated platform, his expression controlled but his mind unsettled as whispers of Elira's identity had begun to circulate among the court. Since the archives incident, Elira stood beside him, still veiled yet no longer invisible. The silence around her no longer felt passive but deliberate. An envoy stepped forward, accusing voice breaking the ceremonial calm, demanding that the bride reveal herself and prove she was not an impostor hiding behind noble deception. The crowd stirred, tension rising like heat before fire, and Adrian instinctively moved forward, but Elira raised her hand, stopping him without looking at him, her authority in that small gesture silencing even trained guards. Slowly she turned toward the crowd and for the first time lifted her veil. Gasps erupted across the hall like a wave crashing through fragile order. Beneath the veil was not ruin nor disfigurement but striking beauty, so intense it unsettled expectation rather than satisfied it. Yet it was not beauty alone that shook the court, it was recognition in the eyes of those older nobles who had once known her lineage before war erased it. Adrian felt memory fracture inside him as fragments of forgotten war reports resurfaced, banners burning, villages collapsing, and a noble house erased under royal command. He realized with growing dread that he had seen her name before, not as myth but as casualty. Elira Valemont, no longer a shadow, spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the hall. I am not cursed and I was never broken. The lie you repeated for years was not truth but protection crafted to erase me from history until I chose to return. The hall erupted in chaos, but she continued unmoved, explaining that she was born Princess Serafina Valemont, last heir of a house destroyed during the Northern War, commanded indirectly by Adrian's father and executed under his early military oversight, though he had never known her survival. Adrian stepped forward, shaken, demanding truth, but she interrupted calmly, stating that truth was never hidden from him, only from those who feared what it would reveal. She explained that she had survived under assumed identity, trained in exile, and returned not only to reclaim position but to uncover those responsible for rewriting her family's extinction. Silence returned, heavier than before, as nobles realized the political structure they trusted was collapsing in real time. Adrian's voice finally broke through, asking whether she had come for revenge. Elira looked at him directly for the first time without veil between them and answered that revenge had been only the beginning but understanding had become the true objective. She revealed that the letter he had burned was sent by an ally within his own court, warning him of manipulation that had shaped both their destinies. The room froze as realization spread that internal betrayal had been guiding events long before their marriage. Adrian felt the ground beneath his authority dissolve as he understood that every decision he believed was sovereign had been influenced by unseen hands, and that Elira had stepped into his life not as victim but as strategist seeking final judgment, not destruction. Elira stepped closer, stating that she did not come to destroy his kingdom but to expose it to itself, and that the veil she wore was never to hide ugliness but to control perception until the moment truth would be most effective. She paused, then added that the curse spoken of in rumors was created deliberately by those who feared her return, using myth to weaken her claim and isolate her identity. Tension peaked as guards reached for weapons, but Adrian stopped them, unable to deny the reality unfolding before him. Elira concluded that the war had never truly ended, it had only changed form, and now its final phase would depend not on armies but on truth. The chandeliers flickered violently as storm light from outside struck the stained glass windows, casting fractured colors across her revealed face, and in that moment Adrian understood that everything he had built, his power, his certainty, and his perception of order, was standing on ground that had never been stable. And as Elira turned away from the court without fear, Adrian realized that the next move would not come from him but from the woman history had erased and now returned to rewrite. For a long moment no one in the hall moved, as though time itself had been stripped of permission to continue. The nobles who once filled the chamber with arrogance now stood frozen under the weight of what they had just witnessed, the transformation of rumor into undeniable truth. Adrian remained still, but inside him every foundation of certainty began to fracture, not in collapse but in awakening. He looked at Elira not as a bride, not as an enemy, but as something far more dangerous, a person who had already survived the ending of her own story and returned with authorship over what came next. The guards who had reached for weapons slowly lowered them, unable to reconcile command with confusion. Elira's presence no longer felt like intrusion but correction, as if history itself had miswritten her existence and she had arrived to edit it without apology. Outside, thunder rolled across the castle walls, shaking stained glass into trembling fragments of color, and in that fractured light Adrian understood the final truth had not yet been spoken, only prepared, and whatever came after this moment would no longer belong to the world they had known but to the one she intended to create. And in that realization a deeper fear awakened within Adrian, not of her power but of how easily truth could replace everything he once believed unshakable and irreversible, beyond any remaining control whatsoever now. And as silence settled again, Adrian finally understood that nothing in his kingdom would ever return to the way it was before this revelation completely changed. Silence held the throne hall like a living force, heavier than stone, sharper than steel, stretching across every trembling breath that dared to exist within it. No one spoke after the revelation, not because they lacked words, but because language itself had become insufficient to contain what had just been exposed. The court that once thrived on power and manipulation now stood stripped of both, left only with the raw consequence of truth. Adrian remained at the center of it all, still as a statue carved from disbelief and realization. The name Serafina Valemont no longer belonged to rumor or history but stood embodied before him in flesh and certainty. Every instinct he had built his life upon urged him to respond as a ruler, to control the collapse unfolding around him, yet none of his training accounted for the quiet devastation forming inside his own chest. Elira did not move toward him or away from him. She simply stood where truth had placed her, no longer concealed by veil or myth. The absence of covering did not soften her presence, it sharpened it. Every noble in the hall understood now that she had not been hidden because she was weak, but because she had been dangerous enough to require erasure. A voice finally broke the suffocating silence, one of the elder council members demanding justice, accusing deception, insisting the marriage itself be annulled. The words attempted to restore structure, but they collapsed under their own irrelevance. Elira turned her gaze toward him slowly, and the man fell quiet mid-sentence, as if realizing too late that authority had already shifted elsewhere. Adrian stepped forward then, not as a duke issuing command, but as a man walking toward consequence. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because of fear but because of recognition. The war she spoke of, the destroyed house, the erased lineage, none of it existed outside his kingdom-sanctioned history. And yet she stood here as proof that history could lie and still be obeyed. "You came here for judgment," he said quietly, voice stripped of its usual command. It was not a question, but an attempt to understand the shape of what she had become. Elira met his gaze fully for the first time without distance. "I came here for truth," she replied. "Judgment was what I prepared for, but truth is what remained when preparation ended." The hall shifted uneasily at her words, as if even the walls understood that something irreversible had begun. Adrian's hands tightened slightly at his sides, not in aggression but in internal struggle. For the first time in his rule, he could not identify the correct course of action through logic alone. "You built your life on the ruins of my family," she continued calmly. But you did not build it alone. You were given those ruins already shaped, already justified, already erased from guilt. The accusation did not strike like anger. It struck like architecture collapsing under its own hidden flaws. Adrian felt it not as blame but as exposure. The foundation of his understanding shifted, revealing not villainy, but inheritance of ignorance. "And now," he asked quieter than before, "do you intend to tear it all down?" For a moment Elira said nothing. The silence between them no longer felt like distance, but like a suspended choice. The entire court seemed to lean into that pause, waiting for destruction or mercy, as though no other outcome was conceivable. Finally she spoke. "No," she said. "Destruction is the language of those who have nothing left to build. I have survived too much to continue speaking it." A murmur passed through the hall, confused and uncertain. Adrian studied her face, searching for hidden fracture, for the expected edge of vengeance. Instead he found something far more destabilizing: restraint guided by intention, not pain. "I did not return to become your executioner," she continued. "I returned because this kingdom was built on selective truth, and selective truth always becomes decay." Adrian exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling deeper. "And what would you replace it with?" he asked. Elira stepped closer then, closing the distance not as threat but as decision. "Something neither of us has ruled before," she said. "A system that cannot survive on secrets. A kingdom where truth is not punishment but law." The words hung in the air like an impossible proposal, too simple to be manipulation, too radical to be tradition. Adrian felt the resistance of every noble behind him, the silent rejection of an order built on concealment. Yet beneath that resistance, something else stirred in him, something he had long suppressed: exhaustion from maintaining illusion. "You are asking me to dismantle everything I control," he said. "I am asking you to see what control has already cost," she answered. For a long moment Adrian said nothing. The court waited for him to assert authority, to restore hierarchy, to reject chaos. Instead he looked around the hall he had once believed was stable. He saw fear disguised as loyalty, obedience maintained through uncertainty, power preserved through silence rather than trust. Then he looked back at her. "And if I refuse?" he asked. Elira did not hesitate. "Then nothing changes," she said. "And everything continues to rot beneath polished surfaces until collapse becomes inevitable instead of chosen." The honesty of it struck harder than any threat could have. Adrian understood then that she was not offering him surrender or defeat, but awareness. The choice was not between her victory or his. It was between transformation and slow erosion disguised as stability. He closed his eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement of how far he had already been removed from certainty. When he opened them again the hall felt different, not because it had changed but because perception had. "I will not rule a kingdom built on deception," he said finally. A ripple moved through the court, shock breaking into disbelief. Elira studied him closely, as though verifying whether the words carried truth or impulse. Adrian turned toward the nobles then, his voice steady but no longer absolute. "From this moment forward, no decree, no record, no alliance will exist without disclosure of its origin. Hidden truth will no longer be protected by rank." Protests began immediately, but he raised his hand once, and silence followed more out of habit than authority. That distinction was not lost on him. Elira remained still, watching him not as subject or adversary, but as one observing a decision finally made without illusion. Something in her expression softened, not into forgiveness, but into recognition. "You are not what I was told you would be," she said quietly. "And you are not what I was allowed to believe you were," he replied. For the first time, neither of them moved to dominate the space between them. Instead they acknowledged it as shared ground. Outside, the storm that had haunted the castle for days began to weaken, as if responding to the shift within its walls. Light pressed faintly through fractured glass, touching both of them in uneven patterns. Elira extended her hand, not as submission, not as demand, but as proposal. "This will not be easy," she said. "No," Adrian answered after a brief pause. "But it will be real." He took her hand. The court did not erupt. It did not celebrate. It simply witnessed, uncertain whether it had just seen collapse or rebirth. But within that uncertainty, something undeniable had formed. A new alignment of power rooted not in secrecy but in acknowledgement. And as they stood together at the center of a kingdom that no longer knew what it was becoming, Adrian understood that love was not what had saved them, nor revenge what had defined them. It was choice. And with that choice ruin no longer meant ending. It meant beginning again under truth that could no longer be undone.